Welcome. Let's look at the motor pathway. The motor pathway of the head region are specialized in controlling muscular action in this region. They help to carry signals from the brain down to the muscle located around the head, face, and neck region to initiate action. And this is what they do basically. This is the motor cortex. So the impulses that are generated from this region are taken down through a pathway for the final execution of muscular action within the face and neck region. So the function of this motor pathway, we've said that they help to generate neural impulses, and the specific region of the brain where this generation occurs is in the motor cortex. Then we have the control of this neural stimulation. They are so controlled in the sense that they run through a particular pathway that is called the motor pathway. This motor pathway helps to control or redirect the neural stimulation that is generated in the motor cortex. After the control of these neural impulses, finally we have the execution of muscle action. So you are able to execute the actions of different muscles that is located around the head region. We're able to project different facial expression through the motor activities that is being executed by the muscles of facial expression. We're also being able to control the temporomandibular joint, maybe during the process of chewing, through the action that is executed by the muscles of mastication. We have the motor cortex that is also referred to as the cortical motor area of the cerebral hemisphere. And this is where the origin of the motor pathway begins. So we have the central sulcus. The central sulcus is a big depression that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. This is the entire configuration of the brain. This is the anterior region and this is the posterior region. So we have the frontal lobe in the anterior region. We have the parietal lobe behind it. Then we have the occipital lobe down at the posterior end. Inferior to this, we have the temporal lobe. So we have the central sulcus dividing the frontal lobes from the parietal lobe. Of course, we know if you go through our previous lecture on the general sensory pathway, we described the sensory cortex has been located behind the central sulcus. If we go through the pattern of the brain, we know we have elevation and depression, elevation and depression. The elevations are the gyral, while the depression are the sulci. So we have the depression. After the depression, definitely we'll be having an elevation behind it. So the elevation is called the gyrus, and the gyrus behind it is called the sensory cortex. Then we have an elevation also in front that is called the gyrus, but this gyrus is the motor cortex. So we have the motor cortex located in front or anterior to the central sulcus, while we have the sensory cortex located behind the central sulcus. And also for us to know that the sensory cortex is a portion of the parietal lobe, while the motor cortex is a posterior portion, to be precise, of the frontal lobe. The motor cortex can also be referred to as the precentral gyrus. Why? Because it is a gyrus that is located before the central sulcus. That is why it is also referred to as the precentral gyrus. While the sensory cortex can also be referred to as the postcentral gyrus, because it is a gyrus that is located behind the central sulcus. So you can see how the origination of the names come into play. So this region is the motor cortex, and this is where we'll be focusing on, and this is the region where the motor pathway begins. Remember when we discussed about the sensory pathway, the final point when the sensory pathway ends is in the sensory cortex. This is where the final termination is for the integration of sensory input from structures located outside the central nervous system. If you go through our lecture on the sensory pathway, you will be able to see that this is the final termination point of the sensory pathway. While in the motor pathway, the motor cortex is the origin, that's the beginning of the motor pathway. Impulses are generated from the motor pathway. They then take it down to structures outside the central nervous system where implementation will take place. And that is why the motor pathway can be referred to as the descending pathway, while the sensory pathway can be referred to as the ascending pathway, because the sensory pathway is coming from the stimulated organ to the central nervous system. Just as we have in the sensory cortex, we also have in the motor cortex. We have a neurological map that is used to represent the different regions of the body within the motor cortex. So this is the motor cortex highlighted, and this has been carved out to see The different region on the motor cortex where the execution of motor activities can occur. So you can see that this is also inverted, with the limbs located in the medial part and the head region located in the lateral part. And also, it's good for us to note the disproportional distribution that is seen on the motor cortex. The areas of specific regions of the body are not represented on the motor cortex as it is. In the real form, there is a disproportional distribution on the motor cortex. We have larger areas on the motor cortex represented with the face region, the tongue, and also the limbs. This has been attributed to the fact that the density of motor innervation in that area is more. Then microscopically, if we look at the histology of the motor cortex, you see a specific type of cell that is called the pyramidal cells or the bent cells. These are giant in structure, they are big, and they are seen with a characteristic long axon. And this has been shown to be necessary because they need to transfer motor stimulation that is generated in the motor cortex down to the brainstem. So they need a long axon for them to be able to execute this function. We also have motor association area. Remember, we said that we have the motor cortex or the precentral gyrus located in front of the central sulcus. So this is the motor cortex. We also have other regions that are located anterior to the motor cortex that are referred to as the motor association areas. And these areas include the premotor area and also the supplementary motor area. Located at the upper region in front of the motor cortex. And we also have the premotor cortex located inferior to the supplementary motor cortex in the anterior part of the primary motor cortex. So this is the primary motor cortex. We now have other subregions located anterior to it that are also responsible in functions that are related to motor action. The supplementary motor area, they help to process sequential motor movement. A good illustration is when we are playing a guitar and there's a rhythmic pattern of movement, and this is where the supplementary motor cortex come into play. They help to control the execution of these motor activities when playing a guitar or other musical instrument. Then the premotor area that is located a bit lower to the supplementary motor area is responsible for the execution of this motor action. Some have also said that they help to integrate information from the sensory cortex and the motor cortex. We now know that the origin of the motor pathway is in the primary motor cortex, and this is the primary motor cortex. But the primary motor cortex will receive input from other sources before they can be able to generate their own neural stimulation. They must get information that will be processed within this space. And where they get this stimulation from could be from the motor association area. They also get information from the sensory cortex behind them. And a good illustration of this is maybe when we have a strike on the cheek, and this is going to generate sensory impulse that is going to travel to the sensory cortex. When it gets to the sensory cortex, this information will be relayed to the motor cortex so as for it to interpret, analyze, and also execute action based on the information that it got from the sensory cortex. So following the reception of this sensory input, the motor neurons form two basic pathways: the pyramidal motor pathway or extrapyramidal motor pathway. The pyramidal motor pathway are involved in voluntary actions that we are aware of and we can control. And also extrapyramidal motor pathway, which are involuntary motor action that we are not aware of and we do not have control over them. For the pyramidal motor pathway, they can be divided into two based on the regions of the body where these actions are executed. And the first one is the corticobulbar pathway, which is restricted to the head region. Any voluntary motor action that is executed in the head region will go through the corticobulbar pathway. But if it is within the limbs and the trunk, it will go through the corticospinal pathway. And of course, we have the extrapyramidal pathway that are involved in involuntary muscle action. The pyramidal motor pathway are so referred to as this because they pass through the medullary pyramid. This is the cerebral hemisphere, this is the midbrain, this is the pons, and this is the medulla. So the pathway, of course, we know that this is the origin. This is where they begin from. This is like the starting point, the motor cortex, and they run through the internal capsule, the midbrain, the pons. They pass through the medullary pyramids. The medullary pyramid is like a collection of white matter structure they are seen like a pyramidal elevation in the medulla, and they are pyramidal in shape. That is why they are called the medullary pyramid. So the pyramidal motor pathway passes through the medullary pyramid. The pyramidal motor pathway, we said that they pass through the medullary pyramid, but to exit the central nervous system is also in two versions. And the first one is after passing through the medullary pyramid, they can exit after passing through it still within the brainstem to innervate muscles around the head region. And that is called the corticobulbar pathway. But when they still go further downwards and exit around the spinal cord, they are called the corticospinal pathway. But the extrapyramidal pathway, we already said that they are involved in reflex or involuntary motor action. They do not pass through the medullary pyramid, and that is why they are referred to as the extrapyramidal pathway. So passing through the medullary pyramid could either occur in two forms. We have the motor cortex around this region. We have neurons originating from them, taking those motor stimulation from that region, going down through the internal capsule, the midbrain, the pons. They get to the medulla, they pass through the medullary pyramid because they are pyramidal motor pathway. After passing through the medullary pyramid, some would either exit around the brainstem, and when they exit, they innervate strictly muscles around the face and the neck region. That is what they innervate. So they are limited just to the head region, and that is referred to as the corticobulbar pathway because they exit around the bulb, which is the medullary pyramid. And this is where we'll be focusing on for the purpose of this lecture. And they could either go downwards, and when they descend downward, the next structure that they are descending along after the medulla is the spinal cord. They descend downward through the spinal cord, and finally they exit around the spinal cord region. When they exit, they now innervate muscles around the upper limb, the lower limb, or the trunk. This is referred to as the corticospinal tract because they originate from the cortex and they exit through around the spinal cord. And the muscles that they innervate are muscles that are located in the limbs and the trunk region. You can see that where they exit around the brain, it can also be related to the region that they innervate. The one that exits around the upper part, that is the brainstem, only innervate muscles around the head region. And the one that descends downwards innervate muscles around the trunk and the limb region. But for the purpose of this lecture, we'll be restricting on the corticobulbar tract, which are innervations within the head region. Let's follow suit with this lecture to see how this pathway unfolds and are able to innervate different muscles that are located around the head region. So for the corticobulbar pathway, we said that they are just limited to the head region. The origin of the motor pathway is in the motor cortex. But for the head region, we also have more specific region within the motor cortex where the origin of the corticobulbar pathway begins, and that is in the lateral region of the motor cortex. Remember our neurological map on the motor cortex where we said that it is inverted. The head is around the lateral part, while the limb is around the medial and the upper part. So we have the lateral part is designated for the muscles around the head region. So this is where the origin will begin from, and not this region where you have the limb. So they originate from this region and they move through the internal capsule, they descend downward before they finally enter the medullary pyramid to exit to now innervate muscles around the head region. So if you look at the corticobulbar pathway, it's a two-neuron pathway. This pathway only involves two neurons. So we have the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. The first order neuron will move from the lateral part of the motor cortex and they will move to the brainstem. In the brainstem, we have a number of nuclei from the oculomotor, the trochlei, the trigeminal, the facial, the hypoglossia accessories, so many other nuclei. So the synapse on one of the nuclei, when they synapse on one of the nuclei, the second order neuron will pick it up from there and take it to the muscles that they are going to be innervated. So it's just a two-neuron pathway. So that is the way they run. So we are going to be taking the entire motor nuclei located within the brainstem, one after the other, and we're going to be relating it to the different muscles or structures that they innervate around the head region. So let's take the first one, which is the oculomotor nerve. The first and the second cranial nerve, the olfactory and the optic nerve, are sensory neurons, not be included within this set of nuclei. So we have the third cranial nerve, which is the oculomotor nerve. The oculomotor nerve, basically what they innervate the extraocular muscles of the eye. We're going to see how this pathway run to innervate the extraocular muscles of the eyes, and they're able to control the actions of these muscles. So we said they are made up of two sets of neurons. So the first set, they run from the lateral. We now know why they are lateral, because this is the region of the motor cortex that is designated for muscles around the head region. The first order neuron, and when it gets to the region of the third cranial nerve, which is the oculomotor nerve, the nuclei, of course, are located around this region. They run a bilateral pattern, running ipsilaterally and also contralaterally. This neuron, of course, is a collection of neurons. It is not just one neuron, but we just try to represent it this way so that the presentation will be neat. So they run down. Some of them will go through the ipsilateral side, while the other will go through the contralateral side. They are now supplying the two oculomotor nuclei on both sides, even though they are coming from just from one side. So we also have this kind of presentation on the other side, so for you to know. So as they come from this other side they run a bilateral pattern by giving ipsilateral connection and also contralateral branch to the nuclei around the other side. And this is the first order neuron. This neuron will synapse in the oculomotor nuclei. When they synapse, the second order neuron will take it up from there, and they run downwards around the eye region to supply the extraocular muscles. It is not the entire extraocular muscle. Okay, they supply the superior rectus, the inferior rectus, the medial rectus, and also the inferior oblique. Those are the four muscles that they supply. The other muscles, of course, will be supplied by the other cranial nerve. If we follow suit, we also get to this point. The second one that we'll be looking into is the trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve is the fourth cranial nerve, and this innervates the superior oblique muscle. This is one of the extraocular muscles that are not innervated by the oculomotor nerve. First order neuron begin from the lateral motor cortex, and they get to the junction of the trochlear nucleus. They also run bilaterally, giving a ipsilateral branch and also a contralateral branch. From there, the second order neuron picks it up from there to innervate the superior oblique muscle, and they help to control the action of this muscle in respect of eye movement. So this is just as what we have in the oculomotor nerve. It's just that they innervate different extraocular muscles. Then the third one we'll be looking into is the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve, remember our lecture on the sensory pathway when we talked about the three nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve has three sensory nuclei and one motor nucleus. So the motor nucleus is what we'll be considering in this lecture, because this is a motor pathway. So the trigeminal motor nucleus is located somewhere around the pons. What they innervate are basically muscles of mastication, and muscles of mastication include the masseter, the temporalis muscle, and also the pterygoid muscles. So the first order neuron will begin from the lateral motor cortex. It runs, and when it gets to the junction of the trigeminal nerve, it also runs bilaterally. It gives a branch to the trigeminal nucleus on the ipsilateral side, and also gives another branch to the contralateral side. Then it synapses with the second order neuron, which picks it up from there and runs down. The muscles that we are innervating in this image is the masseter. Masseter is one of the muscles of mastication. So it innervates it and it controls its action. Then the next one, abducens nerve. The abducens nerve innervates the lateral rectus muscle, which is the last extraocular muscle that is yet to be innervated. We have the other ones innervated by the oculomotor and also the trochlear nerve. So the abducens nerve innervates the lateral rectus muscle, and it also runs through the same pathway as the others to run through. We have the first order neuron from the lateral motor cortex, goes down, also running bilaterally, giving an ipsilateral branch and contralateral branch, where the synapse in the nucleus, and the second order neuron picks it up from there and innervates the lateral rectus. We have the next one, the facial nerve. We know that the facial nerve innervates the muscles of facial expression, which include the orbicularis oculis, the orbicularis oris, the buccinator, the mentalis, the zygomaticus, different muscles that are responsible for facial expression. So this one is a bit different. The pathway that the facial nerve runs is a bit different from the other pathway that I've been describing. So let's see how this goes. Of course, it also involves two sets of neurons. It's good for us to know that the facial can be divided into the upper part and the lower part. So the upper part is painted in black, while the lower part is painted in red. We can also try and divide the face into two sections. We have the right part and the left part, and also further divide into an upper part and a lower part. So let's see how this goes. We have the first order neuron running from the lateral motor cortex, as we've described for the other nuclei. So they run, and when they get to the level of the facial nucleus, because we have the upper and the lower part, for the upper part, they run bilaterally, giving ipsilateral branch and also a contralateral branch. And the second order neuron picks it up from the nuclei in the upper of the, and they go down to innervate muscles that are located in the upper part. And this includes the zygomaticus. So this is one of the muscles of facial expression, but of course it's located around the upper part. It can also innervate the orbicularis oculis, which surrounds the orbit. So where it is a bit different is in the lower region of the facial nuclei. So the first order neuron, of course, begins and follows you downwards. But when it gets to the lower region, it does not run bilaterally. It runs on the contralateral side. So it only gives a contralateral branch to supply the lower part. Then this synapse with the second order neuron, which takes it up from there, and it innervates muscles in the lower region of the face. One of the muscles located in the lower region of the face is the mentalis. So you can see that the facial nerve is a bit different from the other nerves that we have described. And this difference is more highlighted in the lower region of the nuclei, where they only give contralateral branch. Where there is a lesion or injury on one side, it means that the supply from the upper region will be affected, and also the contralateral side. This kind of movement also occur on the other side. So that when there's a damage here, the upper part will still receive supply from the nerve of the opposite side. So they will still receive supply from this region, even though this is cut off. But the lower part will not, because it's only one-sided, and on the contralateral side, muscular action of this region will be lost. Then the next one is the nucleus ambiguous. Nucleus ambiguous contains the nucleus of glossopharyngeal, the vagus, and the accessory nerve. The way they run, the ones we've described, is also the way they run in the nucleus ambiguous. The first order neuron from the lateral part, when they get to the nucleus ambiguous, they run bilateral, giving ipsilateral branch and contralateral branch, and they go and innervate the structures that the named nerves innervate. The glossopharyngeal innervate the stylopharyngeus muscle. The vagus is the palatoglossus. Remember when we talked about the motor innervation of the tongue? Both the intrinsic and the extrinsic muscles of the tongue are innervated by the hypoglossal nerve, except the palatoglossus that is innervated by the vagus. So this innervates the palatoglossus, and the accessory part also innervates muscles that elevate the pharynx and the larynx. Then the next one is the spinal part of the accessory nerve. This is the spinal part of the accessory nerve, and they also run through the same format. The first order neuron begins from the lateral motor cortex. When they get to the region of the accessory nuclei, they run bilaterally, giving ipsilateral branch and the contralateral branch to innervate the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So what they innervate are the sternocleidomastoid muscle and the trapezius muscle around the neck. Then we have the hypoglossial nerve. This is the last cranial nerve that exhibits motor action, and this innervates basically the tongue. And they also present a pattern that is different from the others. We have the first order neuron running from the lateral motor cortex, and when it gets to the hypoglossal nuclei, they only run a contralateral part. So they do not run bilaterally. They only synapse in the hypoglossal nucleus in the contralateral side. So they give a contralateral supply, and the synapse in the nucleus, the second order neuron will pick it up from there and run to supply the contralateral side of the tongue. So you can also do an imaginary division of the tongue into a right and a left part, which means that the hypoglossal nerve from the right will supply the left side of the tongue, while the hypoglossal nerve on the left will supply the right side of the tongue. This is also different with what we have in the presentation with the others. So clinical anatomy. The first clinical anatomy I would like to talk about is the Bell's palsy. And this is when there is loss of muscle action in the face. And this is caused by damage of the facial nerve. We described this when we illustrated the facial motor pathway. We said that if there's a lesion around this point, there's going to be loss motor action in the contralateral lower side. And you see that the patient is able to move the muscles of the upper part, but the lower part, muscular action will be lost. This upper part will be able to exhibit their muscular action because they also receive supply from the facial nerve in the other side, which also run the same pattern. And if there's a lesion on this other side too, it's going to affect the lower part. So that is why you see that there is drooping of the face in the lower part. This form of abnormality could be partial or complete. Partial is when you are still able to exhibit muscle action in some muscles that are located within the face. When there's a total loss, it's termed a complete loss of voluntary muscle action. Then the next one is deviation of the tongue. Yes, the deviation of the tongue can also occur as a clinical anatomy. Remember we said that the innervation of the tongue is the hypoglossal nerve and their innervation is contralateral. So when there's a lesion on this part, because it's contralateral, the supply is contralateral, this region will be affected. And there's going to be deviation of the tongue. Why? Because the activities of this side of the tongue is still normal. There's going to be an overriding action on the tongue, where this will push the tongue towards this side because this is not functional. The muscles within this region, the actions are lost. So this will then push the tongue to deviate to one side, which means that they are deviating away from the lesion. This is where the lesion is, so the tongue will deviate towards the side. If the lesion is around this side, because the supply is contralateral, it's supplying this side, and if there is damage, it means this cannot exhibit action. So it is the force from this that will now push the tongue to deviate. So there's always deviation from the damaged site. And this can be illustrated with the contralateral pattern of innervation that they give in the pathway of the hypoglossal nerve. So this is the brain task, and the first one said we should describe the details using an illustrative diagram, the corticobulbar pathway. So we can pick one of the nuclei, we can pick the fascia, the hypoglossal, the trochlea, the trigeminal, and just describe how the pathway runs. Then list the motor association areas. Which areas are referred to as the motor association areas? List them. Then the third one is to describe the motor cortical homunculus. Can also do this using an illustrative diagram. So thank you for watching. Let's continue to stay tuned to this channel to acquire more knowledge in anatomy.